I want you to picture a very specific moment in time. We are in the 1930s, at the absolute bottom of the Great Depression.
Right, the depth of the crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I really want you to zoom in on a single powerful contradiction from this era. First, I mean, just picture a Black household in America during this time.
Private sector work has, well, completely vanished for them.
Yes, it has completely vanished. The situation is desperate. But then a paycheck arrives.
And we should clarify, this isn't a handout.
No, not at all. This is a WPA paycheck from the Works Progress Administration. It is real money for real work.
Yeah.
It means the rent is paid. It means, the children are fed. And perhaps just as importantly, it carries a measure of dignity that the mere dole, as they called direct relief back then, never really carried.
This is wage labor.
Right. And if you multiply that single household by nearly 1 million, you are looking at a genuine historic advance. I mean, it's a federal program reaching deeper into Black America than any government effort ever had before.
But to grasp the full reality of this era, we have to immediately introduce a second image, one that is existing in the exact same moment.
Okay.
We have to cross the street from that household over to the local relief office that actually issued that WPA check.
The local office.
Inside that office, that very same federal program is being administered by local, overwhelmingly white officials.
And what are they doing in there?
Well, what you find in that office, particularly across the South, is a systematic effort to steer Black applicants away from anything resembling a supervisory or a skilled role.
So they're actively demoting them, essentially.
Yes. You see them being pushed into pick and shovel gangs, menial labor.
Wow.
You see them being enrolled at levels far below what their actual desperate economic need would justify. And you see the bureaucratic machinery ensuring that Black workers are the first ones fired the moment the federal budget tightens.
That is just a staggering disconnect. And today, we are looking at a massive stack of historical archives, government memorandums, and historical analyses to understand this specific contradiction.
The wage on the paper might be equal, but the actual share of the benefit is decidedly not.
Right. And to understand this specific period in American history, we have to hold both of those truths in our heads at the exact same time.
You really do.
I mean, the relief was entirely real. It saved lives.
It did.
And the discrimination was entirely real, and it suppressed opportunity. The central racial contradiction of the New Deal, well, specifically as it ran through the WPA, exists entirely in the space between those two realities.
It does.
So our mission today is to understand how the most equitable federal relief program of its era was simultaneously bent, county by county, to fit the rigid confines of Jim Crow.
And that space between those two realities is where the actual mechanics of the American government operated. That's how the machine worked.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how this contradiction was built, we first have to look at the promise that was written on paper, right?
We do, because the case for the WPA being a genuinely equitable federal effort isn't just historical nostalgia.
No.
It is grounded in the actual policy and the hard numbers of the time. But we must first establish what federal relief looked like immediately prior to the creation of the WPA.
To sort of see why this new policy was so shocking.
Exactly.
Let's lay that groundwork then. If we are looking at the early New Deal, say 1933 to early 1935.
Right, the early days.
What was the standard operating procedure for federal relief, and how was it impacting Black citizens?
Well, the early New Deal relief efforts, the programs that predated the WPA, were drawing incredibly sharp and frankly justified criticism from Black leaders.
I imagine the Black press was heavily involved there too.
Absolutely. Publications like the Chicago Defender and leaders within the NAACP, they were documenting profound inequities.
What kind of inequities?
The treatment of Black citizens during these initial relief rollouts was just highly uneven. In the South especially, the disparity was glaring.
So the local boards were already a problem.
Yes. Early programs often distributed aid in a way that aggressively favored white citizens, and this was despite the demonstrably more severe economic distress in Black communities.
So they needed the help more, but were getting less.
Right. Local relief boards were taking federal money and simply applying standard Jim Crow logic to its distribution.
So it sounds like the Roosevelt administration was getting significant pushback on this early on.
They were facing immense pressure, yes.
How did those early failures shape the design of what came next with the WPA? Because exactly what happened on April 8th, 1935, it seems to represent a major pivot in how the federal government approached this.
April 8th, 1935 is the legislative breakthrough.
That's when Congress passed the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act.
Correct. Which authorized the creation of the WPA.
Yeah.
And what was genuinely new here was the language embedded within the act itself.
The actual legal text.
Yes, both in the act and in the subsequent executive orders that implemented it. They contained explicit anti-discrimination language.
That feels huge for 1935.
It was. It was a formal acknowledgement at the federal level that relief funds could not be distributed based on racial prejudice.
I want to look at the human enforcement of that language, though. Specifically, Harry Hopkins.
Ah, yes. Harry Hopkins.
He takes the reins of the WPA in May and June of 1935, right?
He does.
And based on our source material, he institutes a policy that seems incredibly radical for the era.
Hopkins set a concrete wage equality policy.
Wage equality.
Yes. He established a strict federal ban on paying different wages based on race. Equal wages, regardless of race, became the standard official policy of the Works Progress Administration.
Help me contextualize this, because I think it's very easy for a modern listener to hear equal pay and think, well, that sounds standard for a government program.
Right, today we expect that.
Exactly. But the American economy in 1935 was operating on an entirely different structural norm, wasn't it?
The prevailing wage gap was baked into the DNA of almost every single industry.
Especially in the South, I assume.
Especially, but not exclusively, in the South. The economic hierarchy basically dictated that a black worker should inherently be paid less than a white worker for the exact same labor.
Just structurally, across the board.
Across the board. It was an accepted, unquestioned business practice.
So how jarring must it have been for a federal program to suddenly declare, essentially overnight, that a black worker and a white worker standing side by side on a public works project doing the exact same job would draw the exact same pay?
It was a profound shock to the system. I mean, it was a deliberate, radical departure from the established economic hierarchy of the region.
And did they actually follow it?
Well, historians generally agree that this mandate of wage equality was honored nearly everywhere on paper.
On paper, that's a key distinction.
Very key. But officially, if a specific job classification was designated at a certain wage rate by the federal government, the WPA policy demanded that the rate be paid to whoever held the job.
Regardless of their skin color.
Right. The federal government was establishing a totally new baseline for the value of labor.
And beyond just the hourly rate, there was also a mandate regarding the sheer reach of the program. I'm looking at this operational target set by Hopkins and the newly created National Youth Administration.
The NYA.
Right, the NYA, which operated within the WPA. They aimed to direct roughly 10% of their benefits to African Americans. What is the significance of that specific percentage?
The 10% target directly mirrored the demographic reality of the 1930 census.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, African Americans made up roughly 10% of the total United States population at that time.
So it was about demographics.
Yes. The administrative goal was strict proportionality. The federal government was openly stating that federal resources should reflect the demographic makeup of the nation.
And according to the historical estimates we are reviewing in this deep dive, this resulted in relief reaching roughly 1 million black households during the depth of the crisis.
That is the generally accepted scale, yes.
We also see the establishment of all-black work units.
We do. And strict federal policy dictated that those all-black units were to receive the exact same pay, the exact same working conditions as the all-white units.
Again, on paper, that is incredible for the era.
It is.
Yeah.
When you place this policy against the pervasive, normalized discrimination woven through every aspect of American life in the 1930s,
Right.
and against the failures of those earlier federal relief programs we just discussed, the historical consensus becomes very clear.
The WPA is widely viewed as the most equitable federal effort of its time.
Absolutely. The promise written on paper represented a fundamental shift in how the federal government articulated its responsibility to black citizens.
Okay, so we have this sweeping, radical promise of fairness drafted in Washington, D.C. But as we know, a piece of paper doesn't enforce itself.
No, it certainly
No.
doesn't.
It requires people inside the bureaucracy fighting for it. Who are the individuals actually advocating for this equity within the corridors of power?
The policy was entirely dependent on the internal advocacy pushing it forward. And the most significant figure in that advance was Mary McLeod Bethune.
Mary McLeod Bethune.
Yes, she was already a renowned educator and a towering figure in American public life long before this.
She founded a college, didn't she?
She did. She was the founder of what would eventually become Bethune-Cookman College. She brought immense stature and political gravity to Washington before she ever held a federal title.
The dossier notes her appointment in 1936 to head the Division of Negro Affairs within the National Youth Administration.
The NYA, yes.
What did that appointment represent structurally for the New Deal?
The historical significance of that appointment is really profound. Bethune is generally credited by historians as the first Black woman to head a federal agency or division.
The very first.
Yes. By virtue of this role, she became the most senior Black official of the entire New Deal administration.
That is an incredible position to be in.
It was. But she stepped into a federal bureaucracy that had never seen anyone like her in a position of formal authority. And she faced immense internal institutional barriers designed to maintain the racial status quo.
So how did someone in her position, facing that much institutional resistance, actually force a change in policy? I mean, how did she ensure that the NYA funds were actually reaching Black youth?
She operated with just a relentless pragmatism. She used every single ounce of leverage she had.
What did that look like day to day?
Well, she worked tirelessly to audit the flow of NYA funds. She was constantly demanding data to ensure that resources were actually directed to Black youth in rough proportion to their population numbers.
Holding them to that 10% target.
Exactly. She fought for and successfully secured vital funding to keep Black students enrolled in school and to support Black colleges.
Which were probably really struggling.
Oh, they were facing existential financial threats during the Depression. Furthermore, she leveraged her direct access to the White House.
Ah, you're referring to her relationship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes. Bethune cultivated a very close strategic relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt.
That must have been a powerful tool.
It was her trump card. When Bethune hit a bureaucratic wall within the agencies, say, when mid-level administrators tried to slow-walk funding or just ignore directives.
Which I assume happened a lot.
Constantly. When that happened, she bypassed the chain of command entirely. She took the case directly to the First Lady, who would then champion the issue directly to the President.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is how Bethune brilliantly leveraged a relatively new sub-cabinet agency like the NYA to build an unprecedented level of institutional influence for Black Americans within the federal government.
And she wasn't operating in a vacuum either. She convened a group that came to be known as the Black Cabinet.
She did.
What was the function of this group within the federal structure?
Well, officially, it was also referred to as the Federal Council of Negro Affairs.
Right.
It was an informal network of roughly 3 to 4 dozen Black advisors, professionals, and highly educated experts. People who had been appointed to various roles across the New Deal agencies.
Who were some of the key figures in this?
It included brilliant minds like Robert C. Weaver.
He went on to do big things, right?
He did. He later became the first Black cabinet secretary under Lyndon B. Johnson.
Amazing.
And it also included William H. Hastie, who was a pioneering civil rights attorney and eventually a federal judge.
But if it was an informal network, meaning they didn't have a legal mandate or, veto power over legislation, how did they actually exert influence?
They functioned as a vital coordination and advocacy network inside the government.
Like an intelligence sharing group.
Exactly that. Before this, Black appointees were completely isolated in their respective departments. Bethune brought them together.
So they could compare notes.
Right. They compared notes on which agencies were failing to meet the 10% mandate. They strategized on how to draft policy language that couldn't be easily bypassed.
They were coordinating a unified front.
For the very first time in American history, there were dozens of Black professionals sitting inside federal offices, sharing intelligence, and arguing directly for the rights and relief of Black citizens from within the apparatus of state power.
I noticed in the archives that Bethune also had significant backing from Aubrey Williams.
Yes, Aubrey Williams.
He was the director of the NYA, and interestingly, a white man from Alabama.
Aubrey Williams is a crucial figure here. Despite his background in the segregated South, Williams acted as a forceful, committed internal ally for Bethune.
He supported her efforts.
Fully. He genuinely believed in the fair treatment of Black enrollees and actively helped clear the institutional barriers that Bethune faced.
That top cover must have been essential.
Having the head of the agency fully backing the Division of Negro Affairs gave Bethune the institutional cover she really needed to operate aggressively.
This internal advocacy from Bethune, the Black Cabinet, Hopkins and Williams, it resulted in some fascinating employment outcomes that went far beyond the manual labor we typically associate with the WPA.
It did.
I want to look at a branch of the WPA called Federal One, which focused on cultural employment. What was the federal government funding in this space?
Federal One was essentially a recognition that white-collar and cultural workers were also devastated by the Depression.
It wasn't just construction workers out of a job.
Right. The WPA funded the Federal Writers Project, which, between 1936 and 1942, undertook the massive project of recording the slave narrative.
It's just slave narratives.
Yes. They employed writers to travel and conduct interviews with formerly enslaved Americans. They preserved over 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery.
That is just incredible.
It is an invaluable historical archive that simply would not exist without the specific federal funding.
And alongside the writers, they were funding the performing arts too, weren't they?
They were. Through the Federal Theater Project, the WPA established the Negro Theater Units.
The Negro Theater Units.
Right. This became the most prominent federally funded black theater the country had ever seen. It provided significant professional employment for black writers, actors, directors, and stagehands across several major cities.
When we pull back and look at the landscape of the federal government in the mid-1930s, the picture is just striking. I mean, the government is finally employing Black Americans with pens and on stages and in executive offices.
Not just with shovels.
Exactly, not just with shovels. They are documenting their own history and creating their own art on the federal dime. It is an incredible testament to what was promised and what was fought for in Washington.
The paper promise was revolutionary. The structural advocacy in Washington was unprecedented. But as we established at the very beginning of our deep dive, we have to cross the street.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting.
We have to leave Washington, D.C. and look at the local relief office.
This brings us to the core of the contradiction. Because all of that progress, all of those meticulously drafted executive orders, all of Mary McLeod Bethune's brilliant advocacy, it all had to survive the trip down to the county level.
It did.
So how is the WPA actually administered on the ground?
Well, while the WPA set its overarching policy and its funding levels in Washington, it did not execute that policy directly.
So Washington wasn't handing out the checks.
No. The entire program was routed through state and county release structures. The decisive actors on the ground were the state administrators, the members of the local selection boards, and the project supervisors on the actual job sites.
And in the South, what was the demographic makeup of those local boards?
They were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively white.
I see.
And crucially, they wielded massive day-to-day discretion over the program's operation. They were the actual point of contact where federal policy met the citizen.
Let's dig into the mechanics of how that discretion was actually used, because we discussed the shock of the wage equality rule earlier, the federal ban on paying different wages based on race.
Right.
If a local official in a highly segregated county receives a strict mandate from Washington saying they have to pay a black worker and a white worker the exact same wage for the same job, how do they bypass that without openly violating federal law?
They bypassed it through the immense power of classification.
Classification?
Yes. The federal rule stated that if the posted wage for a skilled role, for instance, let's say a master carpenter, was equal, it had to be paid to anyone in that role.
So if you are a master carpenter, you get the master carpenter rate.
Exactly. The local supervisors couldn't change the wage rate on the master carpenter classification itself. But Washington didn't decide who was a master carpenter. The local supervisor did.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like a modern company boasting, a $50 an hour minimum wage for managers. But then they decide that the person running the entire store is actually just a cashier level 2, and they pay them minimum wage.
That's exactly it.
They aren't violating the posted manager rate. They are just refusing to give the title to the person actually doing the work.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy for how the bureaucracy functioned on the ground. It was a bureaucratic sleight of hand.
So how did this play out for the applicant?
Well, imagine a black man who had been a skilled bricklayer or a master carpenter in the private market for 20 years.
Highly skilled.
Yes. He walks into a WPA office. The local white official, who likely knew exactly how skilled that man was, would simply classify him as an unskilled laborer.
Just check the wrong box on purpose.
Exactly. And what did that classification mean for the worker's reality? It meant he was assigned to a menial, pick-and-shovel job at the lowest possible wage tier.
Even though he had the skills for the higher tier?
Right. And because the posted wage for the unskilled job was the same for a white or black worker, technically, on paper, the federal wage equality rule was perfectly intact.
That is devious.
It was. The effective pay, the actual share of the federal benefit going into that black worker's pocket, was drastically reduced through discriminatory classification.
They used the bureaucratic classification system to mask the bigotry.
They did.
And the damage goes far beyond just the weekly paycheck, doesn't it? I mean, career-wise.
Absolutely. By actively denying black enrollees those skilled and supervisory positions, local officials were denying them the opportunity to build transferable trades.
They were stunting their careers.
They were denying them the resume-building experience that could lead to higher pay in the private sector once the Depression eventually lifted. It was an active administrative effort to lock them into a permanent underclass of unskilled labor, regardless of their actual abilities.
The structural discrimination didn't stop at classification, though, did it? I see notes in the archives about the vulnerability of black workers during budget contractions.
No, it didn't stop there. The WPA was entirely subject to congressional funding cycles.
Right.
When appropriations tightened, which happened quite frequently throughout the late 1930s, the overall roles had to be reduced.
People had to be let go.
Yes. And the historical record shows a stark, consistent pattern during these contractions. Black workers were disproportionately the first to be fired.
The first one's cut.
Always. The local boards used their discretion to protect white employment at the direct expense of black workers.
Let's go back to the 10% target we discussed earlier. The goal set by Hopkins and the NYA to direct 10% of the relief to African Americans because they made up 10% of the 1930 population.
Right, the population mirror.
On its face, the math seems clean. But what happens when you apply that population metric to a relief program?
The fundamental flaw in that logic becomes immediately apparent when you look at the economic data of the time.
How so?
Yes. African Americans constituted roughly 10% of the general population. However, because of systemic racism, long-standing agricultural displacement, and severe economic marginalization, their rates of unemployment and sheer economic distress were far higher than 10%.
They were hurting more.
They were bearing a vastly disproportionate brunt of the Great Depression.
So if a community makes up 10% of the population, but say 30% of the severely unemployed, an honest 10% target is already mathematically shortchanging the actual need.
Precisely. Limiting their relief share to 10% based on general population metrics mathematically condemned a huge portion of that community to starvation.
Because it ignored the actual distress levels.
Right. But the reality on the ground was even worse than that.
How could it be worse?
Local boards frequently use that 10% population benchmark, not as a minimum goal, but as an excuse to actively under-enroll black applicants.
Wait, how does a local board weaponize a demographic target to limit aid?
They would point to the population census and say to applicants, well, we have reached our quota. We have served the 10%.
Unbelievable.
They used a metric designed for inclusion as a hard ceiling to enforce exclusion.
Did anyone call them out on this?
Oh, civil rights organizations of the era and the black press saw exactly what was happening. They heavily criticized this practice, arguing correctly that black citizens were severely underrepresented among aid recipients relative to their actual distress.
The need was vast.
And the administration of the relief was artificially capped by local boards using Washington's own numbers against the applicants.
I want to pause and just think about the psychological toll this takes on a citizen. I mean, you are sitting by your radio and you hear the President of the United States talking about a new deal for everyone.
Right.
You read about Mary McLeod Bethune, a black woman in Washington, promising fairness and equal wages. The federal government is officially telling you that your labor is worth the same as a white man's labor.
The promise is loud and clear.
So you walk into your hometown relief office with hope, and the clerk with the clipboard looks at you, checks a box, and hands you a shovel instead of a foreman's hat.
Because of the classification loophole.
Right. He pays you a fraction of what your skills are worth because he classified you as unskilled. And then he tells you that you should be grateful because they've already hit their quota for your community anyway.
It's devastating.
How does a person reconcile the radio broadcasts with the clipboard?
It creates a profound, unresolvable dissonance. It breeds a deep structural cynicism about the promises of the federal government.
I can imagine.
You are experiencing the relief. I mean, the paycheck is indeed keeping your family alive, but you are simultaneously experiencing a visceral, daily reminder of your second-class citizenship.
A constant reminder.
And the harshest part is that this second-class status is being administered by the very federal program that claims to be lifting you up.
This brings us to a massive question about the architecture of power. We have Harry Hopkins, who instituted the wage equality rule. We have Mary McLeod Bethune fighting internally. We have the White House publicly supporting the rhetoric. If the discrimination was this blatant, this systemic across the local level, and if civil rights groups were actively reporting it, why didn't the administration just stop it?
That is the real question.
Right. Why couldn't Harry Hopkins just pick up the phone, call the local administrator in Alabama or Georgia and say, you are violating federal policies, stop misclassifying workers, or you're fired?
That is the crucial structural question of this entire era. To understand why Hopkins and Bethune couldn't simply fire discriminatory local administrators, we have to unpack the political design of the New Deal itself.
The politics behind the policy.
We have to look at how the WPA was actually passed into law.
Because it wasn't an executive decree, it required a massive appropriation from Congress.
Exactly. The Roosevelt administration in 1935 was attempting to push through a massive, unprecedented expansion of the federal government and the social safety net.
It cost a lot of money.
Billions. To get the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act passed, to secure the billions of dollars needed to fund the WPA, Franklin Roosevelt desperately needed the votes of Southern Democrats in Congress.
And the Southern Democrats weren't just a voting bloc, were they? They controlled the legislative machinery.
They absolutely did. Due to the seniority system in Congress and the one-party nature of the segregated South at the time, Southern Democrats chaired almost all the key committees.
Meaning they could kill any bill they wanted.
They had an effective veto over any major legislation. They were a unified bloc. And their primary overriding political imperative was the maintenance of white supremacy and the Jim Crow economic system in the South.
How did that specific political reality dictate the structure of the WPA?
Well, the Southern Democrats made decentralization their non-negotiable condition for participation in the New Deal coalition.
Decentralization.
Yes. They knew that if the WPA was administered entirely from Washington, if federal bureaucrats came down to the South and directly hired, fired, and classified workers based on strict racial equality, it would completely upend the racial hierarchy of the Southern labor market.
It would ruin their system.
It would destroy Jim Crow economics overnight by giving black workers federal leverage.
So they demanded that the federal government write the checks, but the state and county relief structures decide who actually receives them.
Exactly. They specifically shaped the legislative design of the program's implementation to guarantee local control. They knew with absolute certainty that if local selection boards had discretion over certification, over hiring, and over classification, the norms of Jim Crow would be fiercely protected.
It is a staggering political paradox. The exact same decentralization that made the WPA politically possible in Congress was the very mechanism that made the color line locally enforceable.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the tragedy of it.
If FDR had insisted on centralized federal enforcement of racial equity, the Southern Democrats would have killed the bill in committee.
Without a doubt.
The WPA would never have existed, and there would have been no relief for anyone, black or white.
That is the core structural contradiction. A federal program executed through local white officials in a Jim Crow region will naturally, inevitably reproduce Jim Crow.
It just flows that way.
It is a matter of administrative gravity. National policy, no matter how progressive on paper, could not reach down to the county clerk or the project foreman because the legislative architecture specifically prevented it from doing so.
The structure itself was the barrier.
The federal government built a massive engine of relief, but the political reality required handing the steering wheel to the architects of segregation.
As we try to evaluate this massive historical event, I want to look closely at our source material because the history here is incredibly complex and, in some places, contested, right?
Very much so.
When you are dealing with millions of people over nearly a decade, the records aren't perfectly clean. What are the specific areas in the historical record that require careful navigation here?
There are several nuances we must acknowledge to maintain a factual, objective account. First, the household counts.
The million households.
Right. We've used the figure of perhaps 1 million black households reached by WPA relief. It is vital to understand that this is an order of magnitude, an estimate of scale, not a precise static headcount.
Okay.
The enrollment numbers and the share of benefits fluctuated significantly over the program's 8-year lifespan from 1935 to 1943.
So we use the number to understand the immense reach, but we can't treat it as a perfectly balanced ledger.
Correct.
What about the wage equality rule? You mentioned earlier that there were caveats to that.
Yes. We must apply heavy caveats to the phrase that wage equality was honored nearly everywhere. As we detailed with the classification loophole, posted wage equality coexisted very comfortably with highly unequal classification.
So the law was followed, but the spirit of the law was broken.
Exactly. While the policy of equal wages was officially on the books and technically adhered to regarding the posted rates, the effective pay going to black workers was frequently and highly unequal.
And the 10% target itself, is there debate on how that was officially categorized?
Historians debate exactly how to define it administratively.
Was it a rule or a suggestion?
Right. Was it a firm quota? Was it merely a goal? Or was it a loose benchmark that the NYA just aspired to?
The sources differ.
The historical sources describe it differently depending on which internal memo you read. But regardless of its official administrative designation, it was permanently pegged to population share, not unemployment share.
Which guaranteed it would fall short.
It guaranteed it would fall short of the actual economic need.
I even noticed some variance in the archives regarding Mary McLeod Bethune's exact title.
Yes, there is some debate there.
Wow.
Some sources refer to it as the Division of Negro Affairs, others as the Office of Negro Affairs.
Does the distinction matter?
There is a slight semantic debate over whether she was technically the first to head an agency, a division, or an office. However, her fundamental substance, her undisputed status as the most senior black official of the New Deal, and the profound, tangible impact of her advocacy, that is not contested by any serious historian.
Before we move to our final verdict on the WPA, I think it's important to differentiate it from other New Deal programs.
This is a critical point.
It's very easy to lump all the alphabet soup agencies together under the umbrella of the New Deal, but they operated very differently, didn't they?
This is vital for historical accuracy. We must not confuse the WPA and the NYA with other New Deal programs. Much of the broader scholarship on the New Deal and race blends the records of various agencies.
Which muddied the waters.
They had fundamentally different legislative mandates and vastly different outcomes. For example, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, implemented crop production policies that actively led to the mass displacement of thousands of black tenant farmers.
That's a terrible outcome.
Furthermore, the original Social Security Act specifically excluded domestic and agricultural workers,
which intentionally carved out a massive percentage of the black workforce from its protections. Those are profound structural failures of racial equity, but they are the failures of the AAA and the Social Security Act, not the WPA.
Exactly. This deep dive is strictly about the WPA's unique contradiction. We cannot import the AAA's displacement or Social Security's exclusions as if they were WPA facts.
Because the WPA actually tried.
The WPA actually attempted equity on paper. It mandated equal posted wages, and it created internal advocacy structures. That is what makes its failure at the local level a uniquely complex historical tragedy.
We have laid out the sweeping promise written in Washington. We have explored the intense internal fight led by figures like Mary McLeod Bethune.
Right.
We have analyzed the grim reality of classification loopholes on the ground, and we've unpacked the legislative paradox that made it all possible. So what is the honest historical answer here?
The verdict.
Was the WPA a monumental breakthrough for Black America, or was it a machine of structural discrimination?
The only historically rigorous verdict is that it was both, simultaneously.
Both at once.
You simply cannot resolve the contradiction into either a simple celebration of progress or a blanket condemnation of racism.
Let's weigh both sides of the scale, then, based entirely on the evidence we've covered today.
Okay. Measured against the past, against everything the federal government had done up to that point in the 1930s, the WPA provided a fairer share to African Americans than any program in the nation's history.
It was a step forward.
It established equal posted wages, breaking a profound, entrenched economic taboo. It delivered real, life-saving relief that reached roughly 1 million households.
And the leadership aspect, too.
It brought vital black leadership inside the federal agencies for the first time. And it actively funded black cultural work on its own terms. That is undeniable historic progress.
But the other side of the ledger is equally undeniable.
It is. Measured against the actual need of the black community during the Depression, and measured against the program's own stated anti-discrimination promises, that fairer share was deeply, tragically uneven in how it was given.
Because of the local boards.
Because of the absolute political necessity of decentralization, the benefit was smaller than it should have been. It was deliberately skewed toward menial, unskilled labor through bureaucratic loopholes.
The cashier versus the manager.
Right. And it was the first to be withdrawn wherever local white officials had the discretion to exercise their prejudice.
The relief and the discrimination were not two separate programs running in parallel. They were the exact same program.
The very same.
Your experience of that federal program depended entirely on who you were, what the local power structure looked like, and where you happened to live.
To tell this story straight, based on the archives, is to refuse the easy resolution. It requires accepting the central racial contradiction of the New Deal as a permanent feature of the history.
We are bringing you back to that core theme we started with. Back to holding two truths in frame at the exact same time. We are looking at a government that did more for Black citizens than it ever had in its history, while structurally asking them to accept less than their white neighbors in order to receive it.
It is a staggering historical reality.
It really forces us to look incredibly closely at the mechanics of how policy is actually implemented. The grand intentions of Washington are frequently, and sometimes deliberately, ground down by the realities of local administration.
The policy is only as good as the people enforcing it.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder, something that echoes far beyond the 1930s. We've spent this time analyzing how the decentralization of the WPA was the absolute unyielding political price for its very existence.
Right.
If that compromise, handing the enforcement of federal equity over to local officials who actively opposed it, was the absolute only way the foundation of the modern American social safety net could be built, well, what does that say about the structures we rely on today?
It's a heavy question.
When we look at sweeping federal policies in our own time, whether it's housing, healthcare, or education, we are left to wonder, how many well-intentioned national mandates are still being quietly rewritten every single day by the local officials tasked with carrying them out?
Indeed.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Picture that WPA paycheck one last time and the local office across the street. The paper promised equality. The clipboard delivered something else. Until next time.